along in this quarter. I hope that you're learning something, and for fear that you're not, I've summarized some of the things I've been trying to say at the beginning of this lecture outline today, and what I consider to be the important points of some of the European countries which have direct applications to California conditions. In general, the major factors which are influencing increasing quality in European countries and which are most likely to be influencing increasing quality in California are listed in this first paragraph here. There are others, but I could give you, but these I think are the main ones. First of all, the technological viticultural problems, which have to do with better varieties, better clones of the better varieties, new varieties, recognition of the effect of climate, and also recognition of the effect of viruses on composition, which, even though we've been preaching this from high heaven for a long time, still doesn't seem to have sunk in. Controlled pruning, either by law or by shaming people into it, or both, and disease control which is going to be a very real problem, since the Food and Drug Administration are looking over our shoulders at all times on this. And there's doubtless many others that I could list there. The other is the enological controls that are growing increasingly stringent, and which therefore require more and more knowledge of why these things are being done. And the primary reason for your being here at Davis and so forth, why control the time of harvesting? Many growers and even wineries don't understand the importance of this. Every year, thousands and thousands of tons of good grapes become bad grapes because somebody picks them too soon or somebody picks them too late. Yesterday I was in a plane most of the day, and I was reading an article by Professor Castelli from Perugia in Italy, and he's doing some work on the use of Schizosaccharomyces pombe in reducing the malic acid content of muss. And I was just appalled at the protocol or the plan of the research, because it didn't seem to make any difference to him whether he picked at the grapes at 14% sugar or 15% sugar or 17% sugar or 18% sugar. And that, of course, is one of the things that's wrong in Italy, because people don't pay any attention to those things. And I'll be talking about that on Monday. The question of immediate harvesting is now widely recognized in Europe and in this country. It's the most important change that you can see in a winery in California today. Most people don't, you don't remember 1936, but I do very well. Too well. There was 24 hours was a minimum delay. They didn't have enough crushing facility. It was only their third year, and there were many trucks that stayed in the waiting to be crushed for 2 and 3 days, and that was where the Lactobacillus hilgardia got started in the Fresno area, and resulted in all the Fresno mold and the cottony mold, and part of that came from this delay in harvesting. I worry sometimes about it with mechanical harvesting, where the grapes are already in bruised condition when they come off the vine, and by the time, if there's any long delays, particularly in years of rainfall and fungus diseases, what might happen to the browning reactions and so forth. We don't need to worry about this too much anymore, about immediate pressing, but you'll be surprised at how much delay there used to be. And even good wineries would say, well, it doesn't make any difference whether we press tonight or whether we press in the morning. Well, those 12 hours was the difference between a good Riesling and a brown oxidized Riesling. The use of SO2 is not every place still well understood. There are lots of wines, we had one this morning, with too much SO2. It's particularly difficult where you're trying to make wines with reasonably high acid. with a very fruity, grapey flavor. And then you have a large amount of, you have a low pH, 3.1, 3.2, 3.3, and a great portion of your total SO2 is present as free SO2, as I pointed out this morning. The low temperature fermentation of whites, that's spread about every place in the world now. It's pretty well recognized. Most people understand it very well. Incidentally, going back to the SO2, in case you forgot it from last quarter or didn't have it last quarter, the use of a single dose of SO2 rather than continuous doses during fermentation, during alcoholic fermentation, which results in very high fixed SO2. Since acetaldehyde is the last stage in alcoholic fermentation, it's being produced continuously during alcoholic fermentation. If you keep adding SO2, you keep fixing acetaldehyde. So you have a very high fixed acetaldehyde if you add the SO2 in small portions, which many wineries still do for reasons that I don't understand. The accepted way today is to add the amount that you need at the beginning of alcoholic fermentation and not add any more until after alcoholic fermentation, and keep the fixed SO2 as low as possible. In other words, don't have SO2 there when acetaldehyde is being formed, because it will fix the react with the acetaldehyde and you'll have a large fixed SO2. The laboratory quality control is pretty well established in the larger wineries, although with many exceptions. In the first lecture, which I was just read again yesterday, I said something about this, that I recommended for students to go and visit the wine shelves of a Safeway store. Do you remember that recommendation? And you would be surprised at the lack of quality control that you see in California Sauternes or California dry sherries or anything, as I said in that lecture, anything that has a clear bottle. You can just look at them and you'll see that some of the bottles have been left there too long. Some of the wines have come out of two bottling lines with different wines and so forth and so on in them. That's wrong, and that can be controlled. Systematic sensory evaluation. You can talk to almost anybody in California now and say, well, gee, it scored 16, and they know what you mean. Even the Wine Advisory Board has taken it up, which is damning with faint praise, I would say. They have a new little book out now about more fun with wine or something like that, and also the former editor of Wines and Vine magazine has How to Conduct a Wine Tasting, another little book, both of which borrow on the 20-point scorecard with some erroneous statements, but nevertheless, they're at least it's better than nothing, I would say, for them. And finally, we have better trained winemakers practically every place in the world except Greece and Italy. I would say there that they haven't got there yet. They need them in a number of other countries too. I would say that Chile is a first-class candidate for better trained winemakers, and they have very big problems down there in their winemaking procedure. Some Germans have moved in and tried to help them, but there's nothing better than the local people to do these kinds of jobs. There has been some economic factors that are influencing increasing quality, and I'll mention them not because they're a part of this course, but because we sometimes forget them. The increasing affluence of the American people has made them more, and the increasing leisure time both, has made them more cognizant of wines, and therefore they're drinking more of them. I don't know whether they're drinking more because the wines are better, or that there's more people have more money and therefore they're buying more wines. I like to think it's because the wines are better that they're buying more, but I would have to say that the other factor too, that people have more leisure time and more money, may also be affecting the consumption of wine. It's probably the quality is the important one, because we can look back at what the consumption was during the war. And even with the incentive that you could have a bottle of scotch if you bought a case of California Sauterne, was not enough to turn the trend from dessert wines to table wines. So if quality was a factor, it ought to have influenced them then, but it didn't. They just went on drinking whatever was put on the market because they had to buy it. And it's only since there's been this tremendous increase in quality since about 1962, in the last 10 years, that the wine consumption has shown this very steep rise, although there's been a slow rise over a long period of time. Now, I'm going to continue now with the lectures that we started before on the wines of increasing quality. And the one I had before, I mentioned before, was Hungary. The problem of Tokai, I indicated, was that they're trying to move from small to large-scale production, and with all the problems that brings, the attempt to do quality control from a distance. This is a problem both in Hungary and the Soviet Union. The Soviet Union has a central tasting committee in Moscow, which attempts to do quality control for all of the thousands of wines that are made in the Soviet Union. And of course they don't do a very good job for that reason. And the same thing is true in Hungary. They're attempting to do the quality control from Budapest. And the quality control has to start at the local winery. It's to start with the production of the wine, has to be continued through the processing of the wine, and has to be continued through the final bottling of the wine. I'm very fearful of anybody that attempts to do quality control from long distances. And I have some evidence of that. Some years ago, one of the larger whiskey companies moved their quality control laboratories from the Middle West to Park Avenue in New York. And I knew some of these people who were doing quality control for this big distillery. And they were attempting to operate the distillery in Kentucky or Ohio or someplace in the Middle West off the 10th floor of a big building in New York City. And although they tasted wines every day and so forth, there was no immediate feedback, there was no personal feedback to the people in the plant. And finally they had to move the whole thing back to the Middle West. You can't do quality control from a distance. You have to do it right at hand. And that's one of the problems that's happening here. In both Hungary and the Soviet Union, with the liquidation, and I mean liquidation, of all those people who had familiarity with wines, that is, the people who owned wineries and so forth, there was nobody really left who knew anything about wines. And there was no way they could learn it. There was nobody to teach them. They wouldn't trust foreigners to tell them what to do and so forth. And I watched this now in Yugoslavia, in Hungary, in the Soviet Union. It's been part of the problem of California, the dearth of good judges of wines. We seem to be getting over that period now. Everybody's a good judge of wine nowadays. Even the people in Vit 3 are very good judges of wine nowadays. But as I sometimes find out, and they are much more knowledgeable than they used to be. But I think this lack of experience with wine and lack of personal knowledge of wine has been one of the things that's held back the increasing quality. And I think I could name you some of the larger wineries where the top management has been personally involved in the blending of the wines and so forth, that they have made much further advances in quality control and increasing the quality than those wineries where top management was completely segregated away, and it finally developed that middle management or even lower management had that responsibility. Well, it didn't make much difference to them whether the Sauterne had a certain color or not. It was just another bottle of Sauterne, and at their level of pay and so forth, it wasn't worth their while to create any arguments and so forth. So they let it go by, which was wrong, of course, and top management should have been involved in that. And of course, they lost a lot of wines during the war and in the revolution after the war, so that there wasn't very many wines that were standards of reference. A large amount of the private cellars were confiscated and were drunk up before anybody realized that there was something of what the country could do. The Soviet Union is very interesting because it's a very good example of what can be done with a lot of planning. And there are some very good things to be said for that as far as California is concerned at the present time. I can only say that as much as we believe in this planning and so forth, it doesn't seem to fit the American idea of private enterprise very well. And I can tell you quite frankly that just 2 years ago now, this month, last month, when we seriously questioned the wisdom of planting Chardonnay publicly and white Riesling and Pinot Noir in the Fresno area, we were told in no uncertain terms, and I mean no uncertain terms, that this was none of the university's business, that people who were spending their money on these things were the ones that determined these things, and we ought to keep shut and not scare money out of the Fresno area. That was a very important agricultural area in California. And to a certain extent we have. I can do it in my class because I'm pretty free here to say what wish. But in public, I just say if they ask me that I think it's a unwise decision, but I don't go out and crusade against it, which we were doing at that time. I think we've made a very unwise decision industry-wise by not planning somewhat about what varieties should have been planted in the San Joaquin Valley. And I'm sure there are very many well-intentioned people who criticized the university very severely at that period who will eventually rue the day. It's just not possible, with all the experience we've had in Pinot Noirs, to make a decent Pinot Noir, as far as I know, with all the knowledge that we have in Fresno County at the present time. And yet there are 500 acres of Pinot Noir been planted there, an average cost of $4,000 an acre for planting costs and so forth, which represents a fairly large sum of money that somebody's going to have to pay for. And the person who's going to pay for it is going to be the poor consumer who buys 100% Cabernet, 100% Pinot Noir from our estate bottling in Fireball, Merced County. I guess Fireball may be in Madera County, but nevertheless, point's very good. All right, now the Soviet Union, just to show you what can be done with a considerable amount of planning and a dictatorship of the upper classes, or the lower classes, but now the upper classes. The 1960 plan called for, when they had less than 500,000 acres, called for increasing it by 3 times, in other words, up to 1.5 billion acres. And they have just about reached that at the present time in 12 years. It called for large wineries in every district, as large as possible. This meant general wineries of above 1 million gallons, and 13 large bottling plants located in the large population centers of the country. Specifically in Moldavia. Moldavia is that part of Romania which was taken over by the Russians after the last war. In Moldavia, they went from 5,000 wineries down to 100 wineries during the communization of that area after the Second World War. So this is fairly recent. This was all controlled in the Ministry of Agriculture. It was farmed out to specific organizations to do the actual work. The planning for which varieties should be planted and how they should be planted and how the land should be planted and so forth was farmed out to the people at Yalta, the Central Experiment Station for Viticulture and Enology in the Soviet Union. And the station was increased from about 15 to about 90 senior staff people. So they have the equivalent of about 90 PhDs on the staff at the Yalta station at the present time. A large number of engineers were brought into this, and new equipment was conceived for planting grapes, new methods of trenching for planting grapes, new methods of planting grapes by boring holes with water and things like that. A very wide variety of things were devised, and the equipment was manufactured under high priority and distributed throughout the Soviet Union. Not only did the Central Experiment Station have responsibilities, but each of the regional experiment stations also had responsibility. Their responsibilities included not only specific minor climatic recommendations for varieties, but also included working up recommendations of what to use the varieties for, which types of wine should be made from each variety. And in addition, to make sure that this all worked, they gave each winery a quota. You're going to get so many thousand tons of a certain grape, and from that you're going to make this type and this type and this type. So that the local wineries were told by the local experiment stations exactly how their operations were going to be done. And as I indicated before, the people in the experiment stations in many cases were given a separate job to be the manager of the winery or the assistant manager of the winery or the quality control man in the winery, so that they had absolute control. If there was any doubt about how the control was to be done, every single winery in the Soviet Union, and I've been in a fair number of them now, has a Communist Party official in the winery itself who makes sure that the state plan is being carried out for the winery at the political level as well as the practical level. And he has meetings with all the Communist Party members of the winery at least once a week. They tell you this very frankly. And if anybody is sabotaging the state plan or not making the wines according to the state plan, then the Communist Party steps in as a separate organization, completely separate from the government, and arranges with the minister to change a few people around. Short sojourn in Siberia and so forth usually does wonders for this sort of thing. They also imported a lot of machinery during this period of time. You see Seitz bottle washers, a large number of them. You see Wilmus presses, directly imported from abroad. And then you see only one of those per region or per winery. And then you see the one that they built themselves, using the first one as a model. They simply took the first one apart and made each part of it and then put it back together with the local materials, and that was their new machinery. The biggest problem in the Soviet Union has not been solved yet, and that's the climatic problem. 80% of the grapes in the Soviet Union, and this is a very big problem, it's not their fault, 80% of the grapes in the Soviet Union have to be winter covered. When I was there a year ago, last June, the people I was traveling with had some doubts about this figure. So I managed to polish up enough Russian to ask everybody this question in Russian, and we had people translating too. And the amount of grapes that have to be covered in the wintertime to prevent winter killing varied by different people from 70% up to 85%. So around 80% is a good figure. This means that the grapevine has to be, the roots have to be loosened, a big furrow has to be plowed next to the grapevine, and the grapevine pushed down in the furrow, and then another plow coming along behind it and covering it up so that the vine is literally buried in the wintertime. That's the most important system of winter protection that they use, and they've devised a very elegant system which takes the canes. The canes are first the strings that tie the canes to the wires are loosened, and then the machine comes along and literally binds all the canes, puts them in a furrow, and just behind it another plow comes, all being carried by the same tractor, and covers it up. So they have mechanized this process so they can do literally thousands of acres in a short period of time. Now there are other methods of protecting from winter killing. One is to wrap the canes with straw. Go out and get just ordinary straw from the wheat fields and so forth, and wrap it around the canes. And doing that, they can keep at least some temperature control. But that's a very big problem. The next is that everybody in the Soviet Union feels that they're starving to death, and they have to have sweet wines. They have a fetish for sweet wines. It's very difficult to find a dry wine in a restaurant in the Soviet Union. You usually have to ask several times. Professor Almo can tell you this is a true story. In 1962, we were both at a congress there, and we were eating by nationalities. So we were eating with the Japanese delegation, which consisted of 3 Japanese who thought they understood English but didn't understand either English or French, and so put Professor Almo and I at quite a big disadvantage to carry on conversations. But anyway, we kept ordering wines off the wine list, and they were all sweet. And so one night I said, well, I'll go out and buy wine in the wine store. And I went to the nearest wine store, and I was very lucky. This was in Georgia. They understood what I wanted, and they went looking around, and they never did find a dry red wine in the whole store, although they knew exactly what I wanted. The taste is for very sweet wines, and this, of course, creates a very big problem. The Deli Wines, this is a research problem of Dr. Kunke's and mine, is a process developed in 1911. I won't go into the details of it here because it's not pertinent to what we're about, but it has to do with the type of wine that's being produced. Deli was a scientist at Odessa who said that now, obviously, sugar must have some antiseptic value because yeast will not grow in 80% sugar solutions. And that's true, they won't. And therefore, if you added up the amount of the sugar value as its antiseptic value, plus the alcohol, that would give you the total antiseptic power. And he figured that the sugar had about 1/3 the antiseptic power of alcohol. So that if you had a wine that had 10% alcohol and 10% sugar, that would be the same as having a wine with 10% alcohol plus 1/3 of 10% of the sugar would be a 3 1/3 of antiseptic value from the sugar, the 10% sugar, and so the total alcohol effective antiseptic action would be 13 1/3 in that particular case. Well, they then started to manufacture and did manufacture some wines. The wines were usually around 15% of alcohol and had about 15% of sugar. And this would have the same effective antiseptic value as 5% of alcohol, so the total alcohol effective was around 20 and they wouldn't spoil, and so forth. And this is true, because Kunke and I have published 2 or 3 papers on this now, and it turns out to be exactly right, that if you increase the sugar content enough, you can get stable wines at much lower alcohol content. In fact, if you increase the sugar content up to 75 or 80, you don't have to have any alcohol. You have to have any alcohol. So there's a large percentage of wines, a large number of wines that are made by the deli system. These are what I've called the deli wines here. They're the wines that are made with reasonably low alcohol content, but very high sugar content. Some of them only have 12 or 13% alcohol and have up to 20% sugar. There's quite a number of wines, sweet wines made in the Soviet Union with 20% sugar. The third part of the Soviet industry, and that I think is a retrograde movement, and I would hope they outgrew that with time, as they find that central heating does work, and that the winter is not a period of time to get sick and so forth, and have to drink a lot of sweet things, that you can live without that many calories, and so forth. There's one person that said that the Russians spend all winter getting fat so that they can exercise all summer and lose the fat for the next year. And that's, if you've ever been at a summer resort like Sochi or Yalta, that's essentially true. They go out and do exercises at 6 o'clock in the morning. They lay in the sun, they swim, they throw exercise balls around and so forth. And they get back to Moscow and Leningrad in the fall in reasonably good condition, and then they start drinking sweet wines to get them through the winter, because it's going to be very cold that winter, and they need a lot of fat. And so they live essentially that way. That's an over-exaggeration. The champagne industry produces 3 kinds of champagne, only one of which are of great interest to us. The bottle fermentation process is essentially as they do it here, represents about 10% of the total industry. The tank fermentation represents perhaps around 60 or 70% of the industry, and the remainder represents continuous fermentation. These are 8-tank fermenters. That is, there's 8 tanks in a row. Each of the tanks are completely full. In the first tank, the yeast and the cuvee are introduced. The wine has been sweetened up to 2 or 3% sugar, and a very large inoculum of yeast is produced. The wine is then moved from one tank to the next tank and gradually gets drier. And in the last tanks, they have arranged a system of putting a large amount of helixes in, like you put in a distilling column, or other kind of rough material to collect yeast cells, so that in the last 2 steps of this 8-step fermenting system, they believe that they are getting autolysis of yeast. And so they have in their mind, the idea fixe, that this duplicates the bottle process. They're getting the fermentation going, a little bit less sugar from one tank to the other, and in the final tank, 2 tanks, they're getting yeast autolysis going on continuously. I think that the process is not so continuous as they believe. First of all, they have to have pumps to pump it from one tank to the other. They keep quite a bit of carbon dioxide around to be sure there's no air that gets over the wine. The tanks, as I said, are kept full. How much of the carbon dioxide gets into the wine, I don't know, but I wouldn't be surprised that a fair amount does. Kunke and Mr. O have shown pretty definitely that there is a pretty fair inhibition of alcoholic fermentation, fermenting continuously at high pressure. And we just don't believe that they're getting these high pressures in the tanks without some aid from outside agencies, namely carbon dioxide tanks. And fortunately, the original Russian patents show the carbon dioxide tanks in the drawings. So I don't think it's really continuous. They're very anxious to sell this process to somebody in this country, and are even willing to send somebody over here to show us how to operate it. But the more we've looked at it, the more experiments that Dr. Kunke and Mr. O have made, the less encouragement we've been able to give anybody. Only amounts to 10 or 15% of the total production, but they have sold one of these processes to Bulgaria, or traded something to Bulgaria for it, and they may be going to have one in Hungary. The Romanians won't have anything to do with it. Now, the Bulgarian economy is exactly the same as the Soviet economy. It's all central control from the Ministry of Agriculture, except that I believe the difference is that the Ministry of Commerce has to do with the out-of-country planning for the shipping wines out of the country. They have a big export problem, whereas the Soviet Union doesn't have any export problem. They don't make enough wine for their own needs. But in every other respect, it's exactly the same as the Soviet Union, except they don't need winter covering in Bulgaria. Yes, sir.
How much of the vines are affected by winter covering, and how much damage is it to the vines?
Quite a bit. It reduces the crop quite a bit. They get the canes killed back, clear back to the first bud. They don't get the vines killed, and it varies from year to year. But they showed us pictures of the Ukraine, for example, where non-covered and covered vines, in some years the production was almost the same, but in other years the uncovered vines only had 10 or 20% of the production of the covered vines. So that's a very real problem for them. You have to figure on having a marginal crop perhaps every other year in some areas. And that's too big of an overhead for it.
Too cold all over the ground?
Except about 20%. 80% of the Soviet Union grapes are covered in the wintertime. Sure. Yes.
This dieback canes, short-lived, short-lived vines, this is the truth when they don't cover.
Well, that's one thing, but of course the short-livedness of the vine also occurs because how would you like to be pulled up practically by the roots every year and buried, and then in the spring unburied and so forth? This is a very debilitating process in its own right. And that's why it's going to take 1.5 billion acres in the Soviet Union to produce the same amount of grapes that we're going to get with 500,000 acres in the United States. The production per acre is reduced that much by having to grow grapes under these conditions. Their total production per acre is less than 2 tons per acre, whereas our production per acre is average in California is running 5.5 tons right now. Yes?
Are you saying a billion acres or a million acres?
No, I'm saying, 1 million acres, excuse me. I don't know where that's a typo. 500,000 acres in California will be in 1975, 1.5 million acres in the Soviet Union now. Yes, a question back there.
I've heard you mention a defoliation process in the vines before the pit. What is that for?
Well, they're trying defoliation in order to use mechanical harvesting. And Dr. Almo has tried it here too, and we're very interested, and Mr. O is very concerned about it, because the idea of putting so many leaves in the crusher raises a lot of problems, and several of the big wineries in California have been worrying about it too. And it does seem to account for some of Mr. O's results and so forth, at least be a factor in them. And so one way of getting away from that would be to defoliate the vines before the mechanical harvesting went on, so you wouldn't have to worry about the leaves. The leaves would drop off. Well, the question is how much debilitation that would have on the vines, because the sugar is being moved to the roots in September, in August and September. And if the defoliation takes place too soon, a good part of the sugar is going to go away with the leaves, and it's not going to get to the roots, so you're not going to have all that starch in the roots to get vine growth started in the spring and so forth. And therefore, it's necessary to have several years' experience on this. The Soviet Union is ahead of us on this. They have already, when we were there 2 years ago, had 3 years of experience on use of defoliants for taking the leaves off of vines before mechanical harvesting. They had not found any harmful effects at that time, but that wasn't long enough. I think 5 years would be a minimum program of that kind. All right, let's go through. We have a few more countries to cover, and then we'll... Israel, of course, has an assured sale of wines, kosher wines, all over the world. Before the Second World War, they sold most of these wines in Poland. But of course now, first of all, there are not very many Jews living in Poland anymore, one, and two, Israel couldn't send wine there even if there were 2 or 3 million Jews there because of political and other reasons. Their big handicaps are three. First of all, there's very low consumption. The Jewish people are very modest drinkers, with some exceptions in Hollywood and places like that, where it's a way of life for that type of people. Second, they have a very hot climate. On the Jordan, of course, they even have it hot enough they can have 2 crops a year. First time Professor Berg went there, he came back shaking his head. He thought he had seen something that would just never occurred anyplace else, but it does occur in other places in the world too. Occurs in India, for example, the 2 crops a year. Any place where you have quite tropical climatic conditions, you can get 2 crops a year. And they have a big problem with lack of water, although they're doing really remarkable things in new sources of water and new methods of applying water and so forth. Therefore, they didn't have very much demand for high-quality wine. But in recent years, they've become more dependent on the American market, and it represents to them the best market. And of course, the American Jewish people are not drinking those sweet wines. They want table wines. They want good table wines. They want Cabernets and so forth. And Israel is just not the best place in the world to produce good Cabernets. I gave 3 lectures there in 1967, I guess it was. And the speech is someplace in the library. And you can see that Amerine the diplomat was working very hard in those lectures. It was the most difficult lectures I ever gave. You didn't want to lose your audience and have them walk out on you. On the other hand, you had to tell them that there were some limitations to the condition. They have gotten some very good technical people, however. A couple of them have been trained here. And we helped them organize the Israeli Wine Institute, which is giving them very good advice. They got a man coming from France by way of Uruguay to come in and help them. And so that technically they've been putting in a lot of refrigeration equipment, improving their vineyard pruning methods and so forth. And I think that Israel would have to be said to be a country, in spite of all its handicaps, that is producing better wines than it did 5 years ago, or certainly than 20 years ago. South Africa is another country of increasing quality, which perhaps is making very big strides right now and may produce much bigger strides in the near future. They have the largest scale of supportive research to volume of wine or to acres of grapes of any country than perhaps Germany. At least I don't know of any other country that has the degree of support they have. The experimental winery at Stellenbosch, for example, the floor plan is as big as half the first floor of the Wixon Hall, with beautiful equipment, all automated equipment, large amount of stainless steel equipment and so forth. Of course, labor is very inexpensive for them, so that makes it possible for them to do a lot of things with a lot of hands that we couldn't do at American salary scales. A lot of basic research and a lot of applied research is going on. Furthermore, the KWV, which from bit 3 you'll remember is the control organization of the government for the quality of South African wines, has been very quality conscious all of these years. And they have imposed upon the wineries, by the fact that they buy a good part of their wine, certain standards of production. So they have gotten the wineries to build their wineries better and better. They're gradually getting away from the old concrete tanks. They're gradually putting in more refrigeration equipment. And so in the long run, the KWV may turn out to have been the most important single factor improving South African wines. I think that was a mistake perhaps in California, that the university became the quality control entity in the state rather than the Wine Institute or the Wine Advisory Board. It would have been better from the industry point of view, and I think it would have had more effect if the industry itself had been developing quality standards based upon the university research. But in essence, what happened was that almost all of the quality research emphasis came from the university side, and practically none came from Wine Institute or Wine Advisory Board. With some exceptions, they did put some volatile acid controls into the California Public Health Code some years ago. And they did put out a sanitation guide, but they put the sanitation guide out when they had the Food and Drug Administration breathing down their neck hot and heavy, and they put the volatile acid standards out when they had Milton P. Duffy ready to confiscate the wines that were already vinegar in the wineries in 1934 and 35. So I don't think although they spoke as if they were quality-minded, I don't think that there was really very large conviction on their part that they were forced into it. The KWV is in the present moment, just had a letter last week from the manager, that they are getting ready to promulgate appellations of origin for South Africa and hope to get them accepted on the European Common Market. They are dependent to a certain extent on the European Common Market, and they would like to get into the European Common Market on a larger scale, and they have wines that price-wise would be attractive on the European Common Market. So they will be the first country that has a large-scale appellation of origin with wine types and standards for percent varieties and so forth. The reason I was interested because I saw this was being worked on, and I wanted to know what the result was. I don't know yet. D quality thing is the emphasis on slightly sweet white wines. They do not produce any dry white wines, or very few. Practically all the white wines have 2.4% sugar, which they get by adding fortified wine, or they get by adding what they call mute, M-U-T-E. That's sulfited grape juice. This is because a good many of these wines are going into the colored population, the coloreds, and the Bantus, and they require the sweet wines. That's the kind of wine they like. And they do have some problems of need for newer varieties. They've been backward upon this in the past. Australia has good research, but on a much lesser scale. Perhaps the research in Australia is better on the viticulture side than on the enology side. I'm not sure of that, but I would guess that. The old established firms, the 5 firms that were 100 years old, or that lived to be 100 years old, I think only 3 of them are still locally controlled, or family controlled, always had a quality emphasis. They might produce cheaper wines, but they always had a quality side to them. So there were large numbers of lots, small lots, it may be true, of high-quality wines coming on the market all the time, which represented a frame of reference for the industry and gave the industry something to compare for or something to shoot for. They had very bad problems with lack of varieties because of the plant quarantine for South Australia, which about 75% of all the grapes are grown in that one state. And they didn't want phylloxera, so they put a strict plant quarantine on. And for almost 40 years, no new varieties were brought into South Australia. And that's a long period of time to be without any importation of new strains or new clones and so forth. It was only after some of their students who from here went back and showed them how to get around the quarantine by keeping grapes in a quarantined area for 2 or 3 years and then transport them out of that area into South Australia that they've managed to overcome this handicap. I think they've sent a large number of people here, and so they have some idea of what the importance of quality control is. They're doing an awful lot of large-scale planting now, and they have a large number of Italian immigrants who are asking for more wine, so there's increasing demand, perhaps increasing demand for high-quality wine as their standard of living goes up, and several Americans are helping them plant grapes down there, tax dodges and so forth, in order to be sure they do get anything. Well, in summary, then, there's some other countries where it's not so clear where everything is going. And one of these is Spain, and the other is Portugal. Right now, there's a great interest in importing wines, table wines, for the American market. And the 2 countries in Europe that seem to hold the largest promise for this is Spain and Portugal. I'll talk about Italy as a separate problem next time. And in both cases, they have reached an impasse. In the case of Portugal, the largest American importer has decided that he will simply, has already built, and it's now operating, a winery in Portugal to American standards to get the accepted quality control that they need. And in Spain, there seems to be several developments of the same kind developing now, in which American technical skills would go into Spain, reconstruct wineries, arrange for the production of large amounts of grapes to service these wineries, and make types of wines that would be suitable for the American market. This would not be a new development at all. Port is not a Portuguese wine. Port is an English wine made in Portugal. Marsala is not really an Italian wine. It happens to be a wine that was originally made for the English market in Sicily. And sherry is certainly not a Spanish wine. Sherry just happens to be a wine that's made in Spain originally for the English market. One question and then we'll be finished. Not quite. I got 2 minutes. What was the question? Somebody held their hand up, I thought. All right, let me use up my last 3 minutes then. Well, that's the situation in Spain and Portugal. And anyway, you can find that out. It's not very difficult to find out. The problem in Egypt, Tunisia, Libya, Algeria, and Morocco is twofold. One, the winemakers don't drink any wine. I was in Algeria with Dr. Webb in August of last year, and that's a fact. How can you make wines when you can't taste them? If you do taste them, you've got to go home and beg your father's forgiveness before sunup the next morning. And for a grown man to be doing that sounds to me like a sort of debasing sort of thing for educated people. And besides, the French and Italians didn't leave many winemakers there, so that they have a very big handicap in getting winemakers. And my recommendation would be to just start all over again. Hire some people from outside the country to come in and reconstruct the vineyards and the wineries from the ground up. And that was the recommendation that Dr. Webb and I made, as a matter of fact, to the Algerian government, that it was silly for them to hope to have a big export market and high-quality wines, when in fact the wines were all pretty bad. Mexico, we've had a large number of students from Mexico in viticulture here, but not very many of them in enology. And the wines of Mexico show it. I was just in Tucson last night, so I had a Mexican wine, and I wish I hadn't have had. We have one student, Dmitry Chalyshev, in Baja California, in Ensenada, and a few people who've been here in viticulture but have gone back and they're actually running wineries. But the problem of Mexico is in some respects similar to the problem in Algeria. It's a problem of very hot climate and a lack of technical know-how. And it's just not possible to make high-quality wines in a hot climate unless you have a lot of technical skill. Right after the war, two of the large French cognac companies came to Mexico, hoping to make brandy in Mexico. They both gave up. They said it was too hard. They couldn't control the quality of the wine, therefore how could they control the quality of the brandy that they were going to make from distilling the wine? And so they left, just pulled up stakes and went home, left the barrels and some of the stills there. I wish they had a Mexican wine industry, because we're all going to travel there at some time or other. But at the present time, even from our friends there, the wines are somewhat variable. They tend to be a little on the flat side. Dimitri has made a couple of rosés, which I thought were very credible. There may be some places in Baja California where you can grow grapes high up in the mountains that may be somewhat cooler. Some people feel that's true. But the major problem is you've got to get people that know how to make wine. And there aren't too many of those around. The problem in Peru, as I said in Viticulture 3, is it's just too dry. It's the only country in the world where grape growing has to be a tenuous operation, because the humidity, sometimes for 2 years in a row, there will be no rainfall, and the humidity will be less than 20% for the whole year. Under these conditions, grapes have trouble ripening. They lose their leaves at the time the fruit is on. The fruit withdraws the water from the leaves, and then the fruit itself never gets ripe. The Chilean problem is more complicated. Some of you went to Mr. Casamatis' seminar, and he was talking about grapes, of course, there. But I was there 3 years ago, and it was before the Allende takeover went on. Some of the winemakers have stayed in the wineries. Some of the wineries do not have winemakers at the present time. They are hoping to get on the international market. At least 2 big contracts have been made for there. Argentina is also hoping to get on the American market. The problem of Argentina is partially the problem of Italy, and I'll take up that problem next time. Now, I don't know whether these have been alphabetized or not, but it looks like Mr. Aliotta, Mr. Baker, Mr. Bertram, Mr. Bird, Mr. Brooks.